Welcome to the Bravery Behind the Brand podcast, the podcast that dives deep into the heart of the stories behind the brands we encounter on social media every day. On the surface, they make it look so easy, but I guarantee there is blood, sweat and tears behind all the reels, posts and beautifully presented products. I'm your host, Amanda Jane, a personal branding and communication coach, originally from the north of Ireland and now calling beautiful Cheshire, England, my home. I work with business owners building their confidence and crafting compelling brand stories so they feel comfortable stepping into the spotlight, speaking with authority and selling with authenticity. I experience firsthand the courage that's required to move beyond our comfort zone, and these are the inspirational stories that I want to share. I'll also be doing some solo episodes and sharing useful tips that will hopefully help you to get motivated with your own personal branding and communication. So let's get started. Hello everyone and welcome to the first episode of the Bravery Behind the Brand podcast, a rebrand of the Communicate with Confidence podcast. And I'm going to use the word evolve rather than rebrand because I started this podcast in January of this year. And when I first started it, I really didn't know what I was doing with the tech, with the podcast, what direction it was going to take. So I just went with the flow and I just did the next step and the next step. And over the past few months, I've noticed that there's been some incredible stories and people have been willing to share the stories. And while that may not have been the primary intention of the podcast, the stories still came out and I realised that there were so many incredible stories behind the brands that I was talking about, and a lot of vulnerability, a lot of authenticity and also a lot of bravery. So my mind was taking over and I was thinking, I've got to represent these stories in a better way, in a more authentic way. So hence the evolution of this podcast, so that's what I want to say rather than rebrand. So it has evolved and I'm quite pleased that it's come to this because it would not be me just to stay the same and do the same thing over and over again. So I think it's a bit more of a different slant, a better take on the things that I want to look into. And I love chatting with people, and people also want to share the stories. They want to share their humble beginnings, how their brand has grown and how their brand has evolved. So the format will stay the same. I'll begin with the 3 questions because I quite like those and I love the playlist that has sort of grown out of that. But I'll dig a little bit deeper into the brand. We'll look at the fears that these business owners had when they started and what they had to overcome. And you'd probably be really fascinated to hear the stories, and I know we will be because of the stories that we've been listening to up until this point, but the direction that it'll take us in, I think we'll find it fascinating and inspirational as well. And even for listeners that are thinking about setting up their own business or who are looking at developing their own personal brand or focusing on their own confidence or their own communication, everyone that we meet always has something to teach us. So part of my own brand, I just want to listen to these stories, and I'm always endlessly fascinated with the tales that people have to tell, and it's rare that we ever get to hear these stories. So I am honoured to be able to share these with you, and thank you for listening up until this point. So we're in the thousands of listeners now, and I'm truly grateful and just so humbled that people have listened and joined in and embraced the theme of the podcast. And it's just been an honour to speak to people and who have been so trusting to share their story with me, and I've kept it authentic. And it's important to share those stories because my part of my brand is progress over perfection, and I spent a long time being very hard on myself and thinking that I had to be perfect all the time, and it's something I wish I'd noticed when I was younger. So a part of this brand, of this podcast, is to emphasize that you don't have to be perfect. You just have to make progress. You don't have to make progress the same as everybody else. Even if you're going at a slower pace, it's still progress, but it's your progress, and you don't have to compare yourself to other people. You don't have to do all the glossy stuff that you see on social media. And that's what I want to reflect in this podcast. So if you look at the cover of the podcast, the artwork, you'll see where it says listen now, I've put a little graphic of some wildflowers, and that is just a little nod to the people that have managed to build a business from nothing. And the theme there is bloom where you're planted. So wildflowers signify resilience, individuality, and thriving in unexpected places. So we'll do a little wildflower moment in the podcast as well. And wildflowers bloom in tough environments. We see them everywhere, and when you plant them yourself, you just scatter them. And to me, it symbolises the bravery to grow and flourish on your own terms, even when the odds are against you. And that kind of summarises the entrepreneurial spirit that we see on social media as well, which isn't always portrayed because the business owners want to show you the polished version of themselves, and you don't get to see behind the scenes. But hopefully with this podcast, that's precisely what we will see. So if you hadn't spotted it, take a look at the graphic. But that's just my little nod to all those business owners who've worked so incredibly hard, and they have gone through blood, sweat and tears literally, and a nod to the resilience, individuality and thriving in unexpected places. So bloom where you're planted, and we'll do a little wildflower segment on the podcast. So that's just it for me. I just wanted to give a little explanation to regular listeners as to why the podcast was evolving and what it would look like. And I'm really looking forward to the next stage of the podcast and the next stage of my business as well, because it's so exciting that change keeps happening and it's just moving at such a pace. But I love it because that means it's exciting and new things are happening and we're all learning every day. So if you've got any comments or you want to see anything happening on the podcast or you want to come on the podcast, just drop me a message and I would love to hear from you. And I look forward to bringing you loads of fantastic episodes in the future.